Mr. Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate, of the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defense, but always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's the Historical Gamer. You can call me Matt, and welcome to Episode 7 of the Single Malt Strategy Podcast. I'm here with Jean. You can call him the Strategy Wargamer. How are you doing today, Jean?
Not bad, man. How you doing?
I'm doing great. I guess we'll just get into it. Is today
7? Yeah, and we're featuring it on number 7 of December.
Oh wow, I didn't even think about that. That's spot on. Okay, well, anyway, so today is, well, you're going to be listening to it on December 7th, and it is the 75th anniversary of the Japanese attacks on the U.S. Navy at Pearl Harbor. So Jean and I both figured, what other appropriate time but to talk about World War II games and kind of how they address or how they don't address the attacks on Pearl Harbor that occurred 75 years ago. I will say in somewhat of a sombering realization as I was kind of thinking about the show going in, this is, if you think about it, if you consider major anniversaries like, every 25 years or every, maybe even every 10, but really to me the major anniversaries are like 25, 50, 75, 100, those. If you think about it that way, this is probably, barring maybe one or two exceptions, the last anniversary we will have with Pearl Harbor, with any veterans who'd still be living, who would have at least been in the military at that time.
They're losing about, last article I saw, it's like they're losing about 1,000 a day or something like that. Yeah,
I mean, it's, I know a lot of family members had people who served during World War II. My grandfather, as most people's grandfathers, it seemed, served in that conflict, and it's something we don't think about enough, I think, is that we're losing that connection to the past. I think it was 15, 16 years ago we lost the last veteran of World War I.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's a book about it, actually, about, I think it was called The Last Veteran. And so many people who identify with World War II as being, the sort of definitive generation in American history, whether you agree with that or not, that generation is sadly slipping away. And, part of...
I mean, when you look at it, I mean, the way I look at it is I always tell every veteran that I run into, I said, you know what, you really should write a book. And there's numerous outlets you can do. And the reason why you should write a book is because you get to live, your stories get to live on forever, and I always encourage all of them to write books every time I run into them, because if they write a book, I mean, they do pass on, but their memories, what they experience, live on,
Yeah, and there's a lot of other ways, they can share their stories as well if they want to. I know a lot of them may not want to. My grandfather was always very reluctant to talk about much that he saw when he served. But what I will say is that, it's not just writing a book. Writing a book is a great outlet, and if you can do it, great. But not everyone is necessarily up to that. But that doesn't mean they can't share their stories. There's things like the Veterans History Project, which I was fortunate enough to do with my father before he passed on, where the Library of Congress archives interviews, be they paper interviews, audio interviews, video interviews. They'll archive that in the U.S. Library of Congress as part of the library, as part of the Veterans History Project. So there are other ways to share your stories, which may not be quite as, I wouldn't say onerous, but maybe not quite as challenging is putting pen to paper, although that's certainly a great option as well. But yeah, I mean, I figured
there's also YouTube. YouTube. A lot of people consider whenever people think about YouTube, they always think about like prank shows and stuff like that. But I think YouTube would be a great outlet because when you're talking to a veteran, you're seeing them. Like when you're sitting down with somebody, you're talking to them, right? You're getting a one-on-one. But what would be great is a lot of veterans can sit in front of a camera and then share their story like they're sharing it with you, but they would have a larger audience, as well as, have that video live on forever. People that, live 100 years, that are born 100 years from today can see the pain and the story through this veteran's eyes 100 years after he passed away. I think we should take advantage of not only pen and paper, but also these new media outlets that we have, YouTube being one of them, because you can do a lot with that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And, it's something that, I hope, obviously you don't want to force anyone into it, but as many as are willing and as many who are happy to recount their experiences as can do it would do it. But, another way that we do remember, nice little segue here, another way that we do remember the past and we do remember events such as Pearl Harbor, certainly not as impactful as speaking to someone who was there, but another way we do it, whether we really think about it or not, is through wargaming or through reading books or through videos. But given that, our podcast here is focused on, wargaming, we thought it was appropriate that we could talk about Pearl Harbor and how it's remembered or not remembered through video games, because World War II is the preeminent category or topic to talk about when it comes to strategy or war games. It's definitely the most, at least in the United States, the most popular topic to cover. And Pearl Harbor is the entry point for the United States, which is definitely kind of the most covered in the West anyway, nation's conflict in World War II. And Pearl Harbor was that entry point. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about games, how they cover World War II, and how they address Pearl Harbor. And I know you had some thoughts about, I think what we can just go through is let's talk about some games that, that we're fans of that cover World War II, and how do they remember Pearl Harbor, and how do they cover Pearl Harbor, and maybe is there a better way that games can do it? Because, you'd think about it, in a surprise attack on a largely unprepared fleet, as was the case at Pearl Harbor, it can be difficult to model in a video game, right? I mean, it's not the easiest thing to do to make it interesting or appealing. I think it might be easier for things like first-person shooters. I know Medal of Honor had a Pacific game where you were a sailor on the USS Arizona, and they modeled the attack, but it was kind of through the eyes of a soldier. Obviously, a hyper Hollywood version of the Pearl Harbor attack, but it's able to do that maybe more easily than a grand strategy game could, or a war game could. So what do you think? Are there any games that stand out to you? Are there any games that you really enjoy, or even maybe some that don't do it well?
Well, I mean, while you were mentioning that, it kind of reminded me when we were talking about strategy wargaming that and this kind of relates to the segue. PTO was actually the first game that I started playing. That was a strategy war game, and it just, when you were talking, reminded me about when I first picked up the game. It was back when we had video stores. I remember going in and seeing a PTO on the shelf there, and this was back in the 80s. And I remember picking it up, throwing it into my Nintendo, or I think it was a Genesis system, and this might have been the late 80s, early 90s. I remember there was a lot of, the first thing I remember when I was playing it, I had a family member ever come over to me, and it was like, "What are you playing?" And I was like, "I'm playing a strategy war game." And there was still, even in I think the late 80s, early 90s, some hesitation. It's like, is that appropriate? Should you be playing something like that? And but I think it was really important, for me when I was young to play these games, because it taught me a lot. It got me into history. It kind of led me to pick up books and kind of understand more about World War II, especially after I picked up PTO. It made me wonder what was Nimitz's campaign in the Pacific, as well as MacArthur's campaign. The way because when you pick up, I don't know if anyone played PTO. When you play PTO, there's like hundreds of bases, dozens to hundreds of bases on the map, and you have significant resources. But it's like, are you supposed to take every single island on the way to Japan? So I started figuring out, like, what am I supposed to do? I was just like, well, I need to get to Japan. I want to launch aerial attacks on Japan and like level it to the ground. But I just can't go from Hawaii to Tokyo. So it actually made me pick up books and try to figure out, all right, so this is what they did. I want to see if I can get there faster and try different strategies. So PTO was the first game that I picked up that really got me looking at the Pacific theater of World War II. Particularly, they have an actual Pearl Harbor, if you choose the scenario for 1941, December, you could actually play the Battle of Pearl Harbor, or the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Did you play as the Americans or as the Japanese?
You could do both. So you can play either one. And I played a lot of games in terms of trying to replicate Pearl Harbor. And pretty much all of them is just, it's kind of boring because you know what's going to happen. You know the Japanese are going to destroy the fleet, and that's it. I mean, the Americans were caught off guard because they weren't ready for the attack. So, you know, it's it's not exciting. It's not worth playing in many games. But believe it or not, when you play it in PTO, it's actually challenging because the Americans in the game, you could actually, you know, have the American ships fire back, and which they did in Pearl Harbor, and you could take down numerous. I remember one scenario I played. I took down like probably dozens, maybe even 100 Japanese planes. I crippled the Japanese aerial fleet, which was, you know, kind of remarkable. I was like, wow, I thought this was supposed to be an attack that I really got my butt whipped, but I did pretty well, and I actually had the carriers out to sea at the time, so I just had them intercept the Japanese fleet as they were heading back to Tokyo or Kure. Remember, they were heading back to Kure, and I just did a surprise attack on them somewhere around midway, and I sunk, I think, one or two carriers. So, I mean, it was an incredible game because you not only get to play Pearl Harbor, smash the Japanese aerial fleet, but then I got to use my carriers and surprise attack them and take out one or two of their carriers. So it was pretty exciting.
Yeah, that's interesting that you were able to smash the fleet. I mean, Japan lost 29 planes in the actual attack, and you're talking about wiping out or crippling the Japanese air fleet. But, you know, games are games, right?
Yeah.
I'm trying to think myself of any games that really cover Pearl Harbor, because one thing that I notice is there's a couple, but in general, most or a lot of war games tend to avoid it, or if they do include it, it's not really focused on. It's sort of we're including it because we have to. And I think to your point, you know, Pearl Harbor was a surprise attack. The Americans are caught off guard. The Japanese launched a massive aerial assault and severely crippled the American fleet, losing just a handful of aircraft. So how do you make that interesting in a game? And I really resonate with your talking about some, you know, World War II games, and they kind of teach you the geography, and I'll get into that in a minute. But almost all, I don't think I played a single war game where Pearl Harbor isn't, like, if it's included, it's already planned, it's already strategized, you know, the planes are not in the air, but, you know, there's nothing you can really do to alter the attack. And War in the Pacific really is that way to me. So War in the Pacific, or War in the Pacific Admirals Edition, includes, you know, December 7th. It has a scenario where you can skip it and just get the historical results, or it re-simulates that first day's assault all across the Pacific. So it's not really Pearl Harbor specifically, it's Pearl Harbor, it's Manila Bay with the air attacks on the naval forces there. Yeah. Yep, it's Clark Field. You know, it's all the Pacific. And one thing that I think sometimes gets lost when we talk about Pearl Harbor is how, yeah, Pearl Harbor happened, and it was devastating. But the Japanese launched a series of air attacks over a couple of days that crippled Singapore, crippled the British Navy, crippled Clark Field in the Philippines, crippled the U.S. subfleet in Manila Bay by taking out a tender that had the vast majority of the American torpedoes on board. or actually it might have been on shore. But either way, they took out over 200, of America's best torpedoes, which were crappy, but they didn't know that at the time. They hit Pearl Harbor, and they did end up bombing Wake Island as they were withdrawing. So Pearl Harbor as an event is sort of a seminal event in American history where, everybody knows about it. But it was the impressive feat from the Japanese perspective is that they were able to carry out all of these attacks across a vast landscape. I think the one thing that I never really appreciated until I played War in the Pacific is how far and how difficult it was for the Japanese to get their carrier fleet into position to even be able to attack. I mean, they had to basically do things that people didn't think could be done, with a lot of ocean refueling and using small atolls as kind of staging areas that no one thought could support these large fleets. And Pearl Harbor's out there, right? I mean, the Japanese at the time are mainly in the Central and Western Pacific. It's not a short little jaunt over there for them. It was not an easy attack. And then not only are they, launching the pride of their naval air arm there, they're launching massive air attacks in the Philippines, thousands of miles away. And then hundreds of miles further west, they're attacking Singapore. So just what a truly global series of offensives that were all occurring at the same time is impressive. But again, War in the Pacific doesn't really cover Pearl Harbor per se, other than you see some planes on a screen and it simulates an attack to see what would have happened and you get some results. But there's no real player input there, right? I mean, it's a different kind of game because you don't tactically fight out battles, but it's not really something where your input can alter things from an American perspective. The Japanese, if you're playing as them, you can choose to kind of stick around another day if you want to launch another series of attacks, which, famously the Japanese didn't launch that third wave. You could do that as Japan in the game, but it doesn't really give you any substantial control. And I feel like that's pretty normal. I don't know if you have any other games where you have thoughts on that, or...
Well, I mean, I don't know. I always look at War in the Pacific, which... Actually, I'm looking on Matrix website right now. Because I played this game before, and the game is epic in scope. And I remember playing it. It was a lot to take in. I mean, you had to make so many orders, and there were so many units, and there were so many things you had to do. The scope was so epic. I remember it was probably, when I look at it and looking back on it, it's probably the most epic World War II game that I ever played. If I ever want to sink my teeth into the most enhanced, most epic World War II game, that would probably be it. But I'm kind of like a middle of the road kind of guy. I don't want a game too simple, which there are a lot of games out there like that where you just play a scenario or a campaign and this and that. Kind of like right in the middle. I like games that I would say kind of like mirror PTO or Hearts of Iron, which they don't go into too much detail, where you're managing, oil and, supplies and all this stuff. And you just kind of focus on the military aspect, strategy, and campaign. I think that's like the most fun part. I really don't care how much oil a base has. The military commanders don't want to really even deal with that. I mean, if I was a military commander in World War II, I would probably tell the S3, it was like, look, all I want is oil. Find a way to get the oil here. I don't want to deal with it. Do your job. And then I would focus more on hey, we need to move this division over there. I'll support you with some airplanes, focus on the meat of the conflict. It kind of makes me think. I just wonder why it's it's the 75th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. And, this would have been a perfect time, to have a World War II game, to be on iOS or, on the desktop to coincide with the anniversary of Pearl Harbor. And there's so many developers out there. I just don't understand why not a lot of them say, hey, look, PTO was a great success in its day. Let's modernize that game and release it on the 75th anniversary of Pearl Harbor so we can, get the game out and it would do well. And we can kind of celebrate its anniversary with the game, but
I think to your point earlier, though, that's one of those things that's a little bit tricky, right? I mean, you've got to be careful from a PR perspective that you're not capitalizing on tragedy. I think that's a little bit of a difficult tightrope to walk. But I do think I am kind of surprised and I have an idea on why. But I'm kind of surprised that we don't see an influx of World War II games, coming out. I think part of it is because it has been for so long covered so in depth compared to a lot of other conflicts that people may just be World War II'd out.
But the problem is no one does it. Like the problem that I have with it is like everybody does the same thing, I see. I'm not gonna itemize games, but there's a lot of games that come out and they're like, hey, we're doing our own version of the Civil War, or we're doing our own version of the Battle of World War II or the Battle of Bulge, whatever it may be. But there's so many of them that do the same exact thing. They'll change some of the provinces or whatever, but the game in essence is the same. It's just a clone of another game. There's only a few developers that came out and said, look, we're going to make our own vision. We're going to do something different. War in the Pacific would be one of them. And that was Gary. I believe Gary Grisby came out with War in the Pacific, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, but that was the original one. I mean, the original one was Pacific War, I think it was. And then War in the Pacific was a modern remake of it, and then there was sort of a fan-based, enhancement as well. That was War in the Pacific Admirals Edition, which is only, I think, 6 or 7 years old now. But they're certainly not new games. One,
a good example would be like Battle of the Bulge. Battle of the Bulge by Shenandoah Studios. That really caught my attention because it was different. It was a different take on a game. But I just feel like all the games that come out now are hex-based, and they all feel the same. Like, the actual core of the game feels the same like the other ones, and there's no real differences. And I want a developer to come out forward and be innovative and say, look, I want to do something different. I want to add a new layer of the game. I want to take gaming to strategy wargaming to another level. Everybody keeps saying, well, why should we make new games? There's tons of them out there. Well, innovate, do something different, and that's not happening. It just always gets me. I never understand why.
Yeah. I was trying to think of, other games that touch on Pearl Harbor, and one of them probably fits into what you're talking about, and that's Order of Battle Pacific, which I don't know if it was this year or last year that it came out. But they did Pearl Harbor in an interesting way. They kind of used it as a tutorial level, where as the American side, you were kind of this like lone commander in a jeep, and you had to race around the island while you were under attack and try and get the defenses up and get different units, ready. And I think that was interesting because it kind of tells the story of how the Americans, they were caught off guard, certainly, but to your point, they did definitely start fighting back, and that was, at least according to some of the Japanese, that was why they didn't launch another attack, because the Americans, they were no longer surprised by the time the second wave was going on. Japanese losses were slowly starting to mount, and American defenses were slowly starting to come online, and that was interesting because the Order of Battle Pacific kind of models that, and you kind of have to slowly get the word out, and you're limited to how fast your jeep can go to get these other units activated so you can use them, but you slowly get a little bit more efficient every single turn. So it was a turn-based hex game, but from the American perspective, it was also a pretty unique way to try and cover an engagement like Pearl Harbor. So while the game itself may not be terribly innovative, the scenario design was, in my opinion.
Is Order of Battle kind of similar to what was that game that I used to play? Was it Pacific? There's a game that came in the 90s by SSI, and was it called Pacific War or Panzer? It was kind of like the Panzer General of the Pacific. I think it was.
I think there was. You're thinking of Pacific General, I think.
Yeah.
It's the spirit. Order of Battle is kind of an enhancement off Panzer Corps, which in of itself was a reboot of Panzer Corps to a large extent. So yes, I would say that it's certainly probably has some similarities to Pacific General, although I never played Pacific General, and I'm not sure how the game covered Pearl Harbor. But I did think that was, at least from a scenario design, a very interesting way to try and say, okay, yeah, Pearl Harbor, maybe not the best thing to game from a strategy game perspective, but here's how we're going to, put certain limitations on you as a player so that it's interesting, so that you have to, take an active role in trying to preserve some of your fleet. In order to meet the victory conditions. From a Japanese perspective, it was pretty bland. It was fly around the island and destroy things. But from a American perspective, I think it was very interesting. And even from the Japanese side, using it as a tutorial made sense. And I thought they did pretty well. But that was, that might have been the best handling of it that I could think of any games that I've played. But truth be told, there's not a lot of games that look at the Pacific to begin with. And a lot of times they don't really deal with Pearl Harbor in any sort of meaningful way. I was trying to think, Silent Hunter 4 is not really, I guess we could call it a war game. I think people who would listen to this podcast would enjoy it. It does some interesting things from the Philippines perspective, where it's kind of like the war is slowly starting to break out as you're on station offshore of the Philippines if you're in one of those S-boats, and then Japanese ships start showing up and you kind of have to start sinking them. Depending on the patrol you're in, you might already be at war. But I think that captures another interesting genre that I don't really think anyone's really captured, is sort of this being stuck on a foreign station when World War II breaks out and you're isolated. And from a commander's perspective, have there been any computer games that have ever said be an American commander in the Philippines and try and hold out as long as you can, with limited resources? Yeah, I mean, I think that would be really interesting, right?
Yeah, like on a tactical level where you're commanding maybe battalions or brigades, but that would be a really good game. See, but that's the thing, like I don't understand why a lot of developers that come forward is like, hey, we're making another World War II game and it's going to be on Normandy, or it's going to be on, we're going to do this scenario. They never have ideas where they're like, all right, we're going to put you in position between, bombing of Pearl Harbor in the Philippines at the time of Pearl Harbor, and your job is to hold out as Douglas MacArthur as long as you can, and just go and give you command of those armies. You can go north. I think they were based around Manila, so you can go north, you can go south, southeast. Take advantage of the terrain, try to hold out as long as possible. That would be a really amazing game, but it's surprising. It's 2016. No one's come up with that.
I think the difficult thing with that is really it's like playing Japan in War in the Pacific. You're going to lose. Like, realistically, you're going to lose. The forces at your disposal and the forces that are coming against you is basically like playing zombies in a first-person shooter where they're going to keep coming and coming and coming, and eventually you're going to be overwhelmed. So maybe the lack of a clear victory point. But again, Order of Battle Pacific, actually, I'm kind of singing the game's praises from a scenario design perspective, kind of forces you as the American side to fight a delaying action. Victory is not completely repulsing the enemy. Victory is surviving long enough. Which could be an interesting design. I don't know if anyone would buy it. I think that might be one of the reasons you see everybody always replay, Battle of the Bulge is economics. But I don't know. I think a Philippine... Well, why don't you do this? Why don't you write a letter to Battlefront and have them make a combat mission, Philippines or something like that, and where you get to play at an operational level some of those scenarios. I think that could be interesting.
I think Battlefront would probably... Well, Battlefront's more into, I would say, the game that I'm thinking for the Philippines, and in the idea that you came out with is, I'm thinking a mix of like Order of Battle on an operational scale and a massive map. We're talking about like the entire main peninsula of the Philippines, with each unit representing a brigade. And then your options are, your job is to take advantage of the terrain, set up defensive lines, and try to hold out. I think Battlefront uses their engine, and it's a great game. Battlefront has some amazing games out there, but to design an entire map that big, it would probably tax even the best GPUs, and the game would probably stutter under 30 frames per second.
Well, I think it would probably still be scenario based, but yeah, I hear what you're saying. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Like, how else would you cover Pearl Harbor? You could make a game from a Japanese perspective where you've got an operational game, and you've got to figure out logistics of how you're actually going to get there and attack, and then you've got to plan your attack and actually conduct it. But I don't know if that would sell very well, because I don't think many people in the West, which is where the majority of these games are being sold, are going to say, I want to just play as Japan.
I just have an idea. What would be a really great implementation of a Pearl Harbor game would be, kind of piggybacking off your idea, would be if you design it. Like, for example, there was a game that did this, and this was years and years ago, but I forgot the name of the game. But you kind of design the attack plan at, like, in Japan, right? You're kind of like the Yamamoto, and you're designing the attack plan. You're gonna, say this how many waves. You're gonna show them how to go, the route the fleet's gonna take to get to Pearl Harbor, and then it goes from that to another phase of the game, which you're the Japanese commander, the flagship commander of the Japanese task force. Your job is to kind of navigate the waves, almost like a simulator, where you're on the bridge and you direct the ships where to go, and you have radar and it's picking up the French frigate, I think, at the and then you kind of deal with that issue, and then you go from that to the actual attack where you can command the actual Japanese task force. You get in, and it's almost like a flight simulator. You head over to Pearl Harbor, you do the bombing, and I think something like that would be kind of cool.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Another route you could go wouldn't really be a war game, but it's some sort of RPG where your player, participates in the engagement, either from either side. I think there's a wide open potential market for like kind of Skyrim type RPGs, but in like real world conflicts. I think if you could get the scale and the and make it feel right without it being a straight first person shooter, it could be interesting. I just have this image of walking around Honolulu and then kind of moving over toward what was it? Is Honolulu on the island of Oahu? And then heading over to like Pearl Harbor as you're kind of strolling on. All of a sudden, planes start swooping in. But yeah, I mean, from a war game perspective, it's kind of a shame that it is so difficult to capture Pearl Harbor in a war game. Not because Pearl Harbor should be glorified in any way. I'm not saying that. But again, as a society and as a country, we really do remember a lot of these events. As those who fought there and those who died there, as they sadly pass on. Gaming is part of culture, right? I mean, there's written works certainly are very influential. There's movies, there's books. A lot of those all cover Pearl Harbor in great detail. But another thing of how a lot of people kind of interact with history is through these games. I know games are entertainment for a lot of people, and people don't want to think necessarily critical about it. That's for some people. But again, you're interacting with the past when you're playing a war game, and I think that's the interesting thing about it. It's not necessarily, it can be for some people, but it's not necessarily just a brain dump where you're not really paying attention and you're just vegging out. It can be, but it doesn't have to be.
I think, games like Call of Duty would be a brain out. But, I honestly, I believe strategy war games are, like, I'm in school right now to become a teacher, history teacher. And when I get to school, like, one of the things I hope to influence would be to be like, instead of reading out of a book, like day one that I'm going to be a teacher and I'm going to be teaching American history, I'm going to, influence or try to bring into the classroom. I'm going to say, all right, we're going to start with the American Revolution. Here's Birth of America by Matrix Studios. We're going to play this game, and you guys are going to be commanding the British, and get the kids involved in games like this, like PTO or Birth of America, things like that. The reason why...
I thought you were talking about that. Isn't there a controversial, like, kind of racist film with the same name? I thought that's what you were talking about.
Which I'm sorry.
I thought there was a... never mind. Go on. Sorry.
But I was gonna have these games in the classroom, and because a lot of people, like you were saying, they look at it as entertainment, but I don't. And the reason why I don't is because if I never played PTO, if I never played Liberty or Death by Coe, I would have never looked into or picked up a book about the American Revolution or World War II. In that aspect, I would have been just playing one of those other mindless shooters that was on the Sega Genesis or PlayStation, and not appreciated history. Now, because of PTO, Liberty or Death, and these games that these studios push out, right? Because those influenced my life so much that I have a greater appreciation of history. I go to places like Gettysburg and Antietam and appreciate what those men did on those battlefields. And I go up whenever I run into a World War II vet, I thank them for their service, and I call them a hero because I've read the books, and I've seen, and I invest myself into learning more about it. But it all started with those games because, it put me in a driver's seat. When I picked up PTO, I was a brainless kid. I was like, a single digit, 8, 9, whatever it was. And, I used to play like Super Mario Brothers and, crappy games like that. But when I played PTO, it kind of put me in the driver's seat where it says, all right, this is a war's going on. This is your American fleet. You have these carriers, you have battleships, you have cruisers, destroyers. I don't know what the heck a cruiser was. What is a destroyer compared to an aircraft carrier? Which one is better? I don't know. But as I was playing the game, I was like, all right, well, I need to take out Japan. How do I do this? Well, these aircraft carriers, they carry planes on them. I guess I could bomb them, and then I'm going to have to land some troops, right? Because I'm going to have to take them over. So I need those, and then I had a battle, and then the aircraft carriers think, well, maybe I should have some battleships to escort them. And as I kept playing the game, not only did I get a greater appreciation of history and those men, what they did, but it kind of influenced my military kind of thinking of saying, all right, well, this has to do this, and I'm going to have the cruisers protect the aircraft carrier. So by 12, my friends didn't know crap about history. They didn't even know what an aircraft carrier was, or SX class carrier, or anything like that. And when my teacher picked on me, she was like, all right, so this is what the aircraft carriers are, and this is what they do. I was like, yeah, I know what they do. They protect, they have Corsair planes, and they're good for tactical bombing, as well as, dive bombing. And my teacher was standing there. She's like, how do you know all this? I literally surprised my teacher and every kid in the class. Was just like, they're all like looking at me like, how the heck? I knew more than the teacher in terms of World War II. And it really kind of changed my life. That's why I think these games are very important to bring into the classroom, because if it did it for me, it could do it for a lot of other people. And I think it's important that our students today understand and appreciate history, because if we don't, then we're doomed to repeat it.
Yeah,
but sorry for my little tangent there. But these games like this, they get my blood going, because they're so impactful. They were so impactful for me. They changed my life, and it gets me. It gets me proud that I was able to that had that kind of life.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly hear where you're coming from. I think the thing about the Pacific in general, moving out beyond just Pearl Harbor, I think the thing that war games help me understand from a historical perspective, again, you can get a lot of history from books, from movies, things like that. But it's not. It's not.
Right?
I think you can get I think a lot. You can get a lot from that you can also get from games. But I think.
But like, if you watch a movie like let's say Pearl Harbor with Alec, whatever that. The recent Pearl Harbor.
You might want to pick a good movie rather than an abomination. But.
Well, all right, let's say you watch what is that? Saving Private Ryan. You watch that, and it's a very impactful movie, right? And then the movie's over. You think about it. Let's say you're with your wife, and you say, "Wow, that was an incredible movie. What those guys went through." 20 minutes later, you put on the nightly news, and it's out of your mind. But I think games like this, like PTO or Heart to Iron, you play these games, and it's not just like it's you spend 3 hours playing it, you come back the next night, spend another 3 hours and another 3 hours. Before you know it, you invested 4 months, you picked up books because you're trying to figure out better strategies. And within 6 months, you're like, wow, I know so much more about World War II versus Saving Private Ryan, where after 15 minutes, you're like, oh, yeah, that was I watched a World War II movie last night. It was good. And that's it. Case closed, That's what I feel like these games provide that movies cannot.
Maybe for you. I mean, again, I think movies can be incredibly impactful and important to, a lot of people. But I think one thing, at least for me, that games, and specifically War in the Pacific and PTO 2, I didn't play the first one, but I did play the second one, are able to convey is, it's not sexy, but people never think about just the Herculean logistical efforts that had to go on to fight in parts of the world. And some of these games really drive home that scale. Like, you look at a map in a history course, and it's like, okay, the Pacific's pretty big. There's a bunch of small little islands, but you don't really know what that means. And then when you play a game that has 40 square mile hexes, is one-day turns, and you have to figure out how the hell you're going to move, 40 merchant ships from the west coast of the United States to supply some troops, on an island in the middle of the Pacific. Like, it really drives home just the scale that existed in World War II and the absolute necessity. I think a lot of people are like, yeah, the soldiers, on the front lines, they're the heroes. And I'm not dismissing that, but I think we often ignore how much goes in to these kinds of conflicts. Even today, the logistical efforts, there's 16 support personnel for every combat, individual in the front. And I don't think people necessarily recognize what it really means to go to war, what that effort is, what the expenditure of resources are, what the sacrifices that everybody involved have to make, even if they're not the ones getting shot at. And I think that's something that war games can really push home, depending on the game, depending on the design. Not every game is really going to focus on that. I know it's, you don't necessarily care for the logistics side, but to me, that's what really drove home, like, holy crap, this was, when they say a world war, that's what it really means. And when we think about, what does that mean to us today, if we're trying to say that, they also teach us something about what's going on today and what it means to understand history, I think it gives you some perspective. The United States, before it went into Iraq, okay, it's a place on a map, whatever, we can get there, we can figure it out. And playing these kind of games helps you understand the world a little bit better. They help you understand, what does it really mean if we have access to Turkey so we can attack through northern Iraq? What does that really do? And these kind of games that often focus on topics that are not necessarily the quick, flashy, sexy topic that's going to show up in a movie or is going to show up in a first-person shooter. These kind of games make you think about that, and I think they help you understand the world a little bit better. I think a game like War in the Pacific dramatically helps you understand today in the South China Sea what it means if China's establishing an island chain of fortified islands off the Chinese coast. What does that mean to the United States' ability to, continue operating with its allies in the region? And having that similar scenario in War in the Pacific, when you're trying to overcome all of these fortified islands with much more inferior tech than we have today, can help you understand, when we're involved in these hot spots throughout the world, what are the implications of some of the things that are going on? And they help you understand. They're not necessarily saying, like, in this case, certainly other cases, but they're not necessarily saying we're going to repeat history. But they give you a depth and a breadth of understanding, certainly not as much as if you were actually involved in the incidents. But you can fathom, you can understand what's going on and what's important to the United States in the Pacific, why certain things in the Pacific are important, and why certain geopolitical actions today have significance.
And also, one thing I was thinking about was it also helps you identify where things are. I mean, a lot of people, when you say, hey, I want to visit Wake Island, I live in a big Navy town, and I was working at Apple. I used to run into Navy SEALs all the time, and they used to come in and they're like, yeah, I just came from Guam. I was like, oh, wow. I was like, it's like, yeah, and I just got back from Midway, or, the thing. I was like, oh, wow, how is it there? I was just like, yeah. And I was like, I get amazed about how small that island is. They look at me and they're like, you were in the Navy? I was like, no, I was in the Guard. And he was just like, how do you know about that island? I was just like, oh, I'm familiar with it. And, I'll pick out like all these islands like Attu, or, and we pick them up because we play these strategy war games and we know where they are. But I mean, ask any not normal, but like every average American that's on the street, hey, do you know where Guam is? No. Do you know where, I bet you even if you ask them, hey, do you know where Turkey is? They'll be like, is that somewhere in Europe? A lot of Americans are not familiar with strategic locations because it's just, a lot of them really don't either. I don't know. I'm not sure if they care or it's just the education. I know I'm in college right now, and we literally breezed through. I think I was telling you last episode, we literally breezed through World War II. I mean, my teacher spent most of the class on domestic policies in the United States rather than the Marines storming Iwo Jima or Tarawa or Guadalcanal. I mean, we were like, hey, by the way, so Marines attacked Guadalcanal. We won there. They went to Philippines. We won there, Iwo Jima, and then we dropped some bombs. I'm like, wow, that's it? I mean, that's all you're going to cover. I was just like, we have a class of like 40 people. And you just covered like 3-4 places. We finished the entire Pacific Theater in literally 15 minutes. I thought it was kind of like a little bit of a tragedy. We focused more on domestic policies than we focused on, actual like what these men went through or what they did. It really kind of pissed me off.
Yeah, no, I can certainly understand that and hear you there. Yeah, and I think to your point, I think one of the difficult things is a lot of us us being Americans, we're not great with geography. We may be ignorant to a lot of the rest of the world, but I don't think that's a unique phenomenon. I think people talk about it like, oh my goodness, today we don't know where anything is. Kids in 1940, it's not the definitive end-all be-all on World War II, but if you've watched Ken Burns' Pacific, or if you've read a few books that talk about America before World War II, no more informed than we are today. I mean, they didn't care. It didn't matter to them, right? And the world was a much bigger place then. So you could be even less concerned with the world outside the globe because they weren't we weren't the interconnected world that we are today. But in addition to understanding, what the soldiers went through when they landed on Guam, and in addition to understanding the horrors of combat and the amazing feats of courage and resilience to overcome what they did, and to the Japanese as well, the tenacity with which they resisted us. In addition to understanding the human experience there and what they went through, is also understanding why it matters, putting it in its historical context and understanding why does Guam matter. And I think games tell you that in a way that is hard to gather from a textbook. I mean, this is my own perspective. I know everyone has their different perspective, but in my opinion, playing War in the Pacific tells me why Guam matters, because I can hit Japan with, level bombers. I can hit it with B-29s when I take, Saipan and Tinian and the island group around Guam. And what that tells me is it also helps me understand why Guam was important in Vietnam, because it was a B-29 base that we could hit targets in northern Vietnam. And then I think about today. Guam is a major American military base, as you alluded to, knowing Navy people who are based there. It's an American territory. To any American, why does Guam matter? It matters because it gives us the ability to project power into the Pacific with something that can't be sunk, and is a staging area for American influence throughout the region. It allows us to defend our interests, and it kind of acts as an outpost. America, and we have other bases in the Pacific, but it's just an example of why that geography matters, where its location is, what it allows us to do from there. And it's something that I don't think you can get just from a textbook. Like, yeah, you can read on paper, oh, it allowed, U.S. bombers to hit Japan. But I think when you're actually interacting with it, China's right there too. What does it mean to understand these places' location and their significance in their region? And that tells us about today as well. It helps us understand why things matter today, which is important, right? I mean, it's not just understanding history for the sake of, I know more than the other guy. It's helping you better understand the world as it exists today.
I'm curious, if you had to kind of like take all the schooling that you went through and then kind of compare it to the strategy games you played, how much more of an effect in terms of like your knowledge of where things were, things that you were mentioning, the importance of Guam, how much more did you get from the strategy wargaming versus schooling?
I think I got perspective. I knew a lot from just reading on my own. I can read a book or watch a movie that maybe helps me sense what the soldiers were going through. I won't claim I'd ever know what it was like because I wasn't there. But I can get a sense of like what it meant and some of what they went through. And I knew maybe on a map, like, okay, I mean, I was a big history nerd, right? So, I mean, I knew where a lot of things were because of, books and whatnot. But I think what games gave me was what does that really mean, right? Like, it gave me the perspective that I don't think a book can give me. Saying something's 1,000 miles away means nothing until I have to figure out how I'm going to supply something over 1,000-mile isolated supply chain. And I think that's what really made that more real, made the challenges more real, made the importance of where things were more real, and how everything was interconnected. I don't think a book could ever do that. I think a game was able to do that.
Yeah, that's why I think it's really important to get games into the classroom, and especially like these strategy war games, because I think they can do that for everybody, for all the kids that are coming in, and it can engage them more. I mean, think about it. Kids are now in classrooms; they're taking out their phones and they're twittering, doing Twitter and Snapchat and all this other stuff, right? In the classroom, wouldn't it be better if we could throw like a tablet and say, all right, well, you want to play these, you don't want to deal with books anymore because it's, old technology. Here's a tablet, iPad, whatever. You're going to be playing, Liberty or Death or, PTO or whatever it may be. And it'll kind of give them perspective. Maybe in 20 years, somebody will say, hey, I'm going to Guam. And they say, I know where Guam is. That's somewhere in the middle of the Pacific. It's like, and they'll think back to those days when they were in 4th grade or 6th grade and say, I know Guam because that was where I kind of launched an attack against the Japanese in some game I played a long time ago.
Well, and I also hope when someone goes into a voting booth someday that, if something's going on somewhere in the world and they understand where that is and why that place matters, it helps them understand why something a candidate is saying may be crazy or may be really risky, because they have an understanding of, well, wait a minute, that just screws everything up in that area. That would be a horrible idea, or maybe that's a brilliant idea. Helps you better process the world around you because you have that understanding. I completely agree that, interactive learning is important and games give that to kids. But I also, there's a side of me that's a little bit leery, because I do think that our hobby, maybe less so war games than first person, actually certainly less so for war games than first person shooters, but you've got to balance, teaching about war and conflicts and the past with glorifying it, right? Because I think if you showed kids Call of Duty and just had them running around, like, that would really desensitize you to what war is actually like. Like, I'm sorry, it tells a crap story, and it makes war out to be some kind of fun adventure. It kind of tries to play somewhat into the horror of war, but it really doesn't. And I think the challenge is making those numbers, those little chits there that are on the screen that you're killing, like, it needs to mean something, right? You don't want to make it out to be all, just a happy go fun experience. I'm not saying you need to traumatize kids and be like, here, watch this as this person's arm is blown off. But I think you need to find a balance there, because games do tend to be very much rah, everything is great, go country, whatever country you're fighting as, and, the country you're fighting against is just some nameless face. And I think if you're trying to really hit home with what were the sacrifices that people went through, what does it mean to be at war, if you're trying to use games for that, you need to be careful not to make war out to be some sort of game.
Yeah, and I think it's very important. I really do think that we need to engage people more into this. I remember, thinking back, going back to some of the most influential people I met. I remember when I was in this was like 5 6 years ago. I was in a Apple store in Staten Island, and this guy came in. He was very old, and he was like probably in his 90s, maybe 100, maybe in his 3-digit figures. And I knew he was a veteran because he had a hat on his head, and it said something like World War II vet or something like that. And I picked out some of the medals that he had on his hat, and I started talking to him. He was there for I think a creative session. This was in an Apple store, and I started talking to him. I said, so you were in World War II? I was like, if you don't mind me asking, where were you stationed, this and that? And I was kind of surprised. He told me he was within the first or second wave of the attack on Iwo Jima. And I just stood there. I said, "Are you serious?" And he said, "Yeah." He says, "I was there on the first or second wave." And I said, "So you were infantry?" He was like, "Yeah, we came in." And I asked him, because I was very curious about it, about how the sand felt. I was just like, I never went there. And I was like, and I asked him about his experiences, whatever he was willing to tell me. And, I spent probably like an hour and a half talking to him. And he left, and I remember going back to some of the guys in the back, and we were just talking about stuff. And I said, "You're not going to believe who I met. I met an infantry soldier who actually stormed Iwo Jima in 1945, one of the first waves that took down Iwo Jima. He actually kind of, I think he saw the flag go up. I mean, and they were like, 'Oh yeah, that was nice.'" I was just like, "You guys." And he was like, "No." I was like, "No, that's good." I was just like, "Yeah, that's really good." I'm like, "Okay." And then the next day, freaking one of the people from that Jersey Shore show came in, and everybody was talking about it all day. It was like, "Oh, guess who was here? That person was here," and she was so funny. I was like, "You guys get excited about this dumb?" I'm gonna try to watch my words. This person off this show who's a trying to watch my words here. It was a piece of garbage, right? And we get all excited about this and talk to them and blah blah blah. Meanwhile, and she's worthless as trash. But meanwhile, this guy who was here yesterday, you guys didn't give a shit about. And I really get upset about things like that, because we value people who do nothing. They sit and they put a thumb up. That I'm gonna try to avoid what I'm gonna say, but they're worthless, versus people that actually made a massive difference, in this country's history, and did something legendary, something historic that we couldn't even possibly imagine. We really don't care about them. And I just think maybe, these strategy war games, if we implement them in our schools, or even college, have maybe my college class say, "Hey, let's go and play War in the Pacific, for Matrix games. We have it on the computers. You guys are going to get a shot. You're going to play all each other." Maybe it'll give people a greater appreciation what these people have done,
Yeah, no, I mean, I certainly hear you. I think it's kind of funny to hear you talk about, the overvaluing of celebrities. I don't disagree with what you've said, but I will say I don't think it's a unique phenomenon either, right? I mean, I think this is something that's been going on for decades, even back to World War II. Like, if you think about...
But didn't those guys also partake? I mean, like, I think there were some celebrities in World War II that actually served, right? I mean...
Yeah, no, I'm not saying celebrities are garbage. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that I think American culture has always been kind of infatuated with celebrity. And the ordinary infantryman doesn't rate highly amongst people's priorities, unfortunately. So to your point, I mean, it's certainly something that could be used to give perspective and give people a tie back to the people who went through the things that are being fought out. Again, it's one of those things where I think there's a bit of a balance, because if it's just little virtual blocks moving across the screen, what does that really, does that really immerse you in what the infantrymen went through? Or if you're playing Battlefield or Call of Duty, well, shit, I mean, that makes it look like a good time almost. So, I mean, it's challenging, because there aren't a lot of war games out there that really drive home what it means with what you're doing. It's like, oh, you dropped a nuke and 500,000 people died. Well, what does that really mean? It just says 500,000 on the screen, So I think there's a back and forth there. It can be useful, but there are certainly drawbacks with trying to educate through that as well. So I think
it'll help them pick up. The thing is, I mean, PTO led me to, after playing PTO for whatever amount of time I played it, it led me to say, all right, let me see if there's any movies about this. And I remember going back to that old video store. I think it was called JAF, and going back in Brooklyn and going to the store. And instead of going to the video game aisle, I went to the they had like a history side, which no one ever went to. And I found, what was that old World War II epic, Tora, right? And I picked up that, and I remember going up to the cashier. I was just like, she was like, "Oh," I remember she spent like a half hour trying to find it because no one ever bought it. No, it was just it collected dust in the back, and she gave it to me. And I remember watching, and I was like, "Wow!" And then I picked up another one, and another one, and another one, and then after that, I started picking up some books. So I'm hoping that maybe if they play these kind of games, about Pearl Harbor or World War II, that it'll kind of lead them to say, hey, let me take a look at some of the movies that were made, and then maybe look at some of the books, and then they meet some people that have a greater appreciation meeting those people,
Yeah, maybe. But kind of going back to the gaming topic, because we've kind of gone off on a tangent for the last 20 or 30 minutes, which is fine. I think, given the topic of discussion, it's worth it. I don't know if I can really think of any other games that really deal with Pearl Harbor. I feel like the Pacific is kind of undercovered because from a game perspective, island after island, unless it's a logistics sim, which is really what War in the Pacific is, it's hard to make island hopping too interesting. Order of Battle Pacific kind of does it in an individual scenario base, which again I think is able to keep it more fresh because it's not, again, a grand map. You're going from unique scenario to unique scenario, and you can kind of pick and choose what you want to cover, right? You can cover Guadalcanal differently than you would cover Peleliu or Okinawa, and kind of focus on different aspects that existed in all these island campaigns. But are there any other games out there that deal with the Pacific Theater or Pearl Harbor, if we're so fortunate as to have another one out there that you can think of that you kind of want to add before we finish up here?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that popped up in my head while you were mentioning it, it just popped in that there's I don't know if you're familiar with John Tiller games. John Tiller made a whole. If you go to HPS Simulations, which it's HPSSIMS.com, they have tons of war games, and a lot of them by John Tiller. And I remember when I was in my teenagehood, when I got inspired. I forgot, it was through a Google search, and I found this out because they had a game called The Proud and the Few. It was about the Marine Corps, and I picked this up before when I was actually going into the Marine Corps, and I picked this game up, and it had battles of like Iwo Jima, Wake Island, and a whole bunch of other islands. But it was a very interactive game, and it was a squad based game. It was it went as high as like companies, maybe even a battalion. But you're kind of controlling individual squads, and text based, and it covers like the individual islands. And this was one of the games I remember were really, really interesting, and it kind of immersed me because you're kind of controlling the squad. Also controlling the weapons in the squad. So like if the Japanese kind of like were hunkering in a bunker, you could send two squads to kind of flank them, tell the squad not to engage with semi-automatic rifle fire, but to use the bazooka. I mean, it added a layer of game that was very exciting. I don't think it had, you know what, I think now that I'm thinking about it, I remember they had a Pearl Harbor scenario. I don't know if it was user created because I remember downloading it off the web, but I think they have a Pearl Harbor scenario, which was really good. And I think it was a Pearl Harbor scenario, fictional one, where the Japanese invaded with land troops.
Huh.
So, yeah, if it's not attached to the game, if you do some Google searching, I think I remember pinging off the internet too. They also have another game called Pacific War, which covers other areas in the Pacific campaign. But either game has that scenario. And I remember it was really, really exciting, and it was very challenging, and it was really cool. I really enjoyed the game. One real cool scenario I really liked was the defense of Wake Island. This is a game I'll never forget. And I'm thinking back to when I was 18, 19. I still remember it today. Is you're in charge of the garrison of Marines trying to hold off the Japanese, and you have like a tenth of their strength, and it was very challenging. I remember one of the scenarios I did win, but most of the time I lost.
Cool. I don't think I've ever played a Wake Island game before. That would be interesting. Kind of like the Philippines, where you're kind of doomed due to lack of reinforcements, but a little bit different because the island is, a tiny little island rather than a massive one.
Yeah, I mean, the guys on Wake Island were kind of, it was kind of like, they were never going to be able to get out of it because, U.S. fleet was destroyed. And but it kind of gave you like, it was kind of like the Alamo of the Pacific War kind of thing.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the movie Wake Island might have marketed itself as that as well, the Alamo of the Pacific.
Wait, there was a movie called Wake Island, really?
Yeah, there was a movie about the Battle of Wake Island. It was made. It might have been made during World War II.
Really?
If not, it was shortly thereafter. It's one of those old, pro, kind of. I don't know what celebrities were in it, but it's one of those old World War II movies, kind of 40s, 50s time frame, all black and white.
Yeah, I gotta start watching. I usually watch the movies that are. I never caught the movies on during the that were made in World War II. I always went for like the color movies because I don't know. Like I started with Tora, and then I went to what was the other movie that Midway, I believe. Midway was another movie, I think.
I feel like those were all made at the same time because it wasn't like Charleston Heston in both of those,
Yeah.
and he was like the same, and I think they had the same Nimitz. They had what's his name? Really famous actor who played
Martin Sheen's father, right?
I don't think it was Martin Sheen's father. No, it was God, I can't remember his name. But he played Nimitz in a bunch of World War II movies, and I can't remember. Maybe it was.
Yeah, I'm doing a Google search of it. Henry Fonda.
Fonda. Yeah, that's who it was.
1976.
It's kind of ironic that Henry Fonda was in all those pro-U.S. war movies, and then his daughter's activities during Vietnam. But anyway, one other thing I guess we probably shouldn't leave out. I don't. A lot of people don't consider them, and I'm using quotation marks for everyone who's obviously watching my pretty face because there's no video. Flight simulators. A lot of times those aren't considered war games per se, but I do think it's worth calling out that a lot of flight simulators do actually have Pearl Harbor scenarios. Any war, flight sim from something like Pearl Harbor 0 Hour, which is like this almost like 3D third person like flight sim arcade simulator, to more hardcore sims. I'm not really that into flight sims. Not that I don't enjoy them, I'm just not very good at them, and I haven't really played a lot of them, so it's hard for me to say, like, oh, this is a great Pearl Harbor example. But I think if you're trying to capture Pearl Harbor, flight sims are probably the way to go, right? Because you still get to fly around the plane. If you're flying as the Japanese, you get to bomb stuff. If you're flying as the Americans, you get to fly up against massive, overwhelming numbers. So, I mean, it's an interesting scenario in that perspective as a flight sim. Where it's a little bit more focused in on the actual aerial combat as opposed to a war game, which usually has a broader scope. But yeah, I think the only one I can really remember playing growing up was called Pearl Harbor 0 Hour, and that was not realistic at all. It was, like I said, just kind of like a third-person arcade-type flying game.
I forgot which. I remember I played a couple flight simulators. I can't remember the names of them, but I remember there's a couple of them that I used to play. It was back in the 90s.
I played the hell out of Mighty Eighth, which was about the 8th Air Force in Europe. And then I played the hell out of Falcon 4.0, which is like a modern-ish Korean War simulator. But not a whole lot of Pacific War, which is interesting because, with all the carrier battles, Midway, things like that, you would think there would be a wealth of opportunity. I suppose maybe it's boring flying over the ocean, but I think there actually are several Pacific War flight sims. I think they're kind of in like the early 2000 range in terms of when they came out, which I wasn't really doing much wargaming at the time, so it was hard for me to... Well, I was doing some, but I wasn't doing really much in the way of flight sims around that time outside of Falcon 4.0, so it was really hard for me to kind of connect to them.
Do you know the B-17 Flying Fortress, the Mighty Eighth, the game that you were just mentioning? It's on Steam. I'm just...
I know, I have a YouTube video about it.
Oh, you do? Nice. I always wanted to play this game because I always wanted to pilot a bomber in World War II, and I heard this was an amazing game. I never got to play it.
It's amazing, but it's obtuse. So it's one of the old Microprose flight sims. Like, you literally can go, if you want, you can sim it. But if you want, you can go through like a 40-button click process to, start and feather your engines as a B-17. So it's...
But isn't that kind of cool? I love that stuff like that.
The sound effects are amazing, as you hear the engine kind of start charging and kicking up. And the graphics are horribly dated, and you've got all these blocky, like, 3D figures. But in my opinion, it might be the best World War II flight sim for Europe that's ever come out because it really captures the bombing campaign. And it's, just... absolute attrition and difficulty and kind of overcoming these things. It's just my only complaint is I wish they'd make a modern version where instead of 12 bombers flying on the screen, you've got like 400 or 1,000 with modernized graphics. Otherwise, it's a brilliant game.
This game came out in 2000. This screams for a sequel with modern day graphics and epic scope.
Maybe you can fly around with lasers too, just maybe some TIE fighters thrown in there with some Star Destroyers and,
little Battlestar Galactica Vipers going in.
Sure, you've got maybe Hitler's in like a Cylon base, somewhere or something like that.
Yeah, but the one thing I will say about these flight simulators, I remember, I forgot who made mine. I think it might have been Microprose too, but it was about the Pacific Theater. I remember you could land on a carrier. I forgot which game it was, but it gave me a greater appreciation for the different types of fighters in these games. And I remember when I started the flight simulators and I played with the Tiger. I think it was the Tiger class, and then I went through the iterations of Tiger to the Bearcat to the Hellcat to finally the Corsair, and you kind of like just like, wow, what a difference. The Corsair compared to the Tiger Cat, it was just night and day difference. And so when I play games now, or when I look at books and I look at like the pictures in there, I'm like, man, Tiger Cat to a Corsair. And sometimes I even talk to veterans, and I'll have a couple of them that piloted those planes. I was like, one will say, yeah, those Tiger Cats. I was like, yeah, you guys must have like hated them. It's like, yeah, they weren't that great. And they're like, but the Corsairs were amazing, right? He's like, yeah, that they were much more. And like I'm talking to him as if I piloted them, but I never did, obviously. But I was able to like have a conversation with them based upon these simulators. I always thought that was really amazing.
Yeah, the few I tried and played, I was really good at crashing into the side of an aircraft carrier. I probably would have made a great kamikaze, but not so much a carrier aviator. It does, again, it does kind of drive home the difficulty when you play some of those games. Like, what does it mean to operate an aircraft carrier? What are the challenges that people overcome? It's kind of interesting because right now Russia has an aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean trying to support operations in Syria, and they're really struggling. And it's in large part because operating carriers at sea under combat environments is difficult. And
they only have one, right?
They only have one. They don't have a whole lot of aircraft. They have very limited experience. A lot of their equipment's kind of breaking down, but it just goes to show, like, yeah, these planes can take off and land just fine on shore, but when you've got to do it aboard a pitching or rolling, ship, it adds a whole new element.
What did the aviators call it? They called a control crash or something like that?
I think, yeah, that's usually what they refer to. But anyway, I think, we've been going for about an hour, 10 minutes, and I know we've been trying to kind of rein ourselves in to be closer to an hour-long podcast. So unless you've, I think I've said about all I have to say on this topic, other than just, if you are fortunate to know any veterans out there, and they're willing to share, treasure them while you can, because there are very few left, and there are fewer every day, unfortunately. And this is the anniversary to a tragic event, not only because of the attack on Pearl Harbor being devastating for U.S. military personnel and their families and the victims there, but also the fact that it inaugurated the Second World War, which I do think is a war that you kind of have to say had to be fought given what was going on in the world at the time. But that's no less tragic that, at least from an American perspective, by all means the war was ghastly enough already, but was the beginning of 5 years of unremitting terror and horror from an American perspective. Again, the world was already well on its way to that, but and we shouldn't forget about that either, that we were latecomers to the tragedy. But again, this just sort of represents the 75th anniversary to a monumental event in history, and I don't think it's covered well enough in games. I don't know how to cover it better per se, but I think it does serve a purpose to do, and that's all I have to say. I don't know if you want to send us off, Jean, and kind of add your closing thoughts.
I mean, I think you said it best. I just every time I run into a veteran, whether it be World War II or Korea, or Vietnam, I always tell them thank you for their service, or even like the recent wars, because regardless of how we feel about the conflict politically, these are men and women that signed up to fight on behalf of our country, and I am eternally grateful for them and for what they've done and their sacrifices, regardless of what they say. And I always run into them and they say, I'm not a hero. I was like, well, you may think that, but you're a hero to me. And I always leave off with things like that, because even if you're an infantryman or you're doing supply here in the U.S. and you never deployed out ever in your career, whether it be 4 or 8 years, you're still a hero, because you chose to put on that uniform. And you never know what can happen tomorrow. We can go into a world war, and you might not be pushing boxes anymore. You might, be grabbing a rifle, and you might be a casualty. These are guys men and women that have answered the call, and they're all heroes in my book.
Don't talk about us going into another war, please. Not. I think was it like 2 days ago, Trump was getting in a Twitter argument with the Chinese over the South China Sea. We don't need to be fighting.
I was kind of surprised by his Twitter comment about. I always find that I look forward to SNL every week now, because I always expect he kind of lets them on. It's kind of like a child, It's kind of like they make fun of him. He says something back in Twitter, and they're like, "Oh, he says something this week. Let's do something again next week." And this is going to go on for the next 4 years.
Well, I didn't really mean to get political, other than just pointing out that the world is ever destabilized, and we certainly. World War II is another time, but let's not pretend or be lulled into a false sense of security that a large-scale conflict can never occur again. And again, understanding what happened and why, and it's why history is important. It gives us perspective, and it helps us understand what consequences really can mean. And World War I and World War I is probably a better example of a war that didn't need to occur, but did, and plunged the world into utter despair. And while we may have had relative peace, I know there certainly are conflicts and things going on throughout the world that are horrific. We've had relative peace, even with 9/11 and everything, since the end of probably Vietnam, I'd say. But from a global perspective, even, those wars paled in comparison to World War II. We don't want to be lulled into the sense that none of that could ever happen again, and that there couldn't be some sort of conflict. So again, that's another reason that these kind of things are important, and understanding consequences of action, and understanding what things really mean, and why things are important to different countries, and why things are important to us, and where lines need to be drawn or shouldn't be drawn. And I think Wargames help give us perspective there. But, with that being said, I didn't mean to get too philosophical. We kind of turned this into a little bit more of a philosophical podcast than a Wargame podcast. Rest assured, next time around, I'm sure we'll have some lighthearted banter about whatever Wargame topic we may come up with then. But until then, guys, I appreciate you tuning in to episode 7 of the Single Malt Strategy Podcast. We continue to grow every episode. We continue to have success. Last month, November, was our best month yet. October had been our best month before that. September was better than August. So every month we've steadily climbed the ranks of views and listens, and we definitely appreciate everybody listening and weighing in on their thoughts in the YouTube video when it comes up, and also please listen to us on iTunes. And if you haven't already left a review on iTunes, go ahead and do that, because that does help us out. We're interested in any feedback you may have. But that's enough of me rambling for you guys. For Jean, this is Matt. Thanks for tuning in, guys, and until next time, we're out.